Howdy y'all, Quiet Night Gaming is back for another contributions video. With each generation of Pokemon games, there are newly added changes lasting in at least some or all of the following generations, which we consider as contributions. Therefore, new additions that were exclusive to a generation, such as the bug catching contest in Generation 2, is not considered a contribution to the core series as a whole. Last time we covered Generation 1, and this time it will be Generation 2. The transition from Generation 1 to Generation 2 meant that for the first time, the Pokemon franchise would undergo a major change since its release in Generation 1, which will be covered here. Again, this will stick with the main series content, so Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Of course, with every new Pokemon generation, there are new Pokemon and moves added to the franchise. Gen 2 was no exception by increasing the Pokemon and move amount to 251. This meant a nice boost to the total Pokédex, as well as the overall Pokemon move pool. What started out as an Easter egg in Generation 2, shiny Pokemon have become arguably the most enticing thing to the series for many Pokemon fans. These rare, altered colored forms of a Pokemon began with Pokemon Gold and Silver. Being tied to a specific set of IV values, these highly sought after alternations were only a 1 in 8,192 chance of encountering in any wild battle. A very straightforward yet integral part of making Pokemon more unique was Gen 2's addition of Pokemon genders. The addition consisted of Pokemon species having a ratio of male and female percentages that determined the occurrence rate for each gender, or neither if the Pokemon was genderless. This opened up the doors for its association with breeding mechanics. Breeding was also a crucial mechanic in Pokemon games by allowing players to generate multiple offspring for a specific Pokemon. By manipulating details with the parent Pokemon, players could easily create Pokemon offspring with desirable stats, moves, and so forth. While much simpler since the mechanic's inception, Generation 2 still set forth the field for later Pokemon games. It established Pokemon egg groups, and in order to breed, Pokemon had to share an egg group, as well as one parent needing to be a male and female, with the exception of Ditto. The hatched egg would be a part of the mother's or non-Ditto species line. It also had an inheriting mechanic where moves and stats could be passed down from the egg to the Pokemon. This allowed for much higher odds for breeding for shiny depending on the IVs of the parent, or at least if one of them was a shiny, since it was determined by IV distribution in Generation 2. Although inheritance has been reworked in later gens, the base premise has remained since Generation 2. Anytime new Pokemon are added to the total, there's potential that some may be a part of the previously existing evolutionary line. With Generation 2 being the first update to the National Pokédex since its creation, this began the idea that previous evolutionary lines are subject to updates. For instance, Golbat received an evolution to Crobat in Gen 2, and many pre-evolutions in the form of baby Pokemon were added like Pichu and the queen herself, Cleffa. With each dual release of Pokemon games, is your choice based on the cover legendary Pokemon? When Gold and Silver released, it began a long-lasting trend in the series where Pokemon of the cover art featured the main legendary as the focal point in the artwork. Game Freak has always incorporated savvy pieces of technology in their Pokemon games to assist the player with their journey. With having a staple edition in the Pokédex, which I covered for Generation 1, Johto's generation took it a step further by adding the Pokégear as well. This allowed you to access a clock, radio, map, and even communicate with the in-game NPCs. Even though the Pokégear is exclusive to Generation 2, I still consider it a contribution since it was the blueprint for many other assisting devices to go alongside the Pokédex, such as the Pokénav in Gen 3 and the Seagear in Gen 5. There were a handful of major and small changes to the Pokemon type chart in Generation 2, the major being the addition of the Dark and Steel types. This heavily reduced the dominance of Psychic types in Generation 1 by providing both an immunity and resistance to the Psychic type, since the only resistance to Psychic type in Generation 1 was the Psychic type. It also allowed for a higher prevalence of fighting types due to both Dark and Steel being weak to fighting types. A few of the smaller changes to the type chart were Ice now dealing half the damage instead of normal damage to fire types, Poison now dealing normal damage to Bug instead of it being super effective. Likewise, Bug is dealing half the damage to Poison instead of being super effective. Ghost now deals twice the damage to Psychic types instead of it being immune. And both Magnemite and Magneton both had their Steel types added to their Electric typing. All in all, these changes to Gen 2 provided important updates to the type chart. A few of the permanent changes were made to the move pool as well. Karate Chop went from normal to fighting type, Bite from normal to dark type, Gust from normal to flying, and finally Sand Attack from normal to ground type. It's actually quite surprising that Gust and Karate Chop started out as normal type. Although smaller, these changes have lasted since their update in Generation 2. It can be easy to forget a time that the special stat was combined to include both the special attack and special defense for a Pokemon. While starting in Generation 2, the special attack and special defense of Pokemon were split into separate stats, which was a crucial change for understanding battle strategy in Pokemon. These changes also meant that all Pokemon from Gen 1 had their stats reworked to have their special attack and special defenses separated. A slight detail beginning in the Generation 2 games was that the enemy trainers such as the ones fought in routes not only have a trainer class like youngsters, but they also have a name like Youngster Joey. This is something that can easily be overlooked by many trainers that skip reading the dialogue, but a nice additional touch for those that do. One frustrating thing about playing the original Gen 1 games is managing your item bag, since every obtainable item is put into a single storage space. Generation 2 began a nice improvement to the item bag organization by having items stored into different sections: normal items, key items, Pokeballs, and a slot for TMs and HMs. There were a couple of changes that made the user interface quicker and more intuitive to utilize. One of which was the allowance to register a key item that could be used at any time the select button was pressed. This meant that you could now quickly access your bike or fishing rod for a more convenient use. The other change was the interaction with certain objects that allowed usage of overworld moves. This included surfing when interacting with water, trees with potential to be cut or headbutted, and so forth with other overworld moves. I often forget the initial weather mechanics began with Generation 2, since it was so popularized and quite prevalent in subsequent generations. However, its initial beginnings in Generation 2 brought about a very critical aspect to the game in terms of using it for competitive advantages, which would be a continuing trend throughout the mainline games. Pokemon has never had a specific set of rules for what content is included in the game after becoming champion of the region. However, I'd argue that the ideas for true post-game content began in the Generation 2 games. The ability to explore the Kanto region gave the player new areas and content that they could not have access to prior to becoming champion. Although post-game content varies greatly between games, Generation 2 started the trend of incorporating some type of gameplay that did not just involve catching legendaries and filling up your Pokedex like Gen 1 did after getting the credits to roll. One of the major selling points from the initial release of Gold and Silver was their ability to keep track of time using an internal battery. This meant that the player could utilize the in-game clock to keep track of the time. They could also take advantage of events tied to specific days of the week as they progressed through the game, such as days of the week sibling events. It also brought about changes based on the time of the day that you were playing at. The lighting of the game would shift depending on if the trainer was playing in the morning, day, or nighttime, along with changes to the spawn pool and rates of Pokemon during changes in time as well. While these features were somewhat abandoned in Generation 3, it has been adopted in later generations. Pokemon Yellow started the idea of friendship with Pikachu, and I covered that in the Generation 1 contributions video. However, Generation 2 took it a step further by applying to every Pokemon that you capture in the game, and not just Pikachu and Yellow. It also tied in mechanics associated with it, such as friendship evolutions like Umbreon and Espeon, as well as moves like Return and Frustration. Friendship is certainly something that many trainers could easily ignore. However, there are many situations where its importance are relevant in Generation 2 and later games as well. A major component to battle strategies in Pokemon is effective usage of held items. Beginning in Generation 2, all Pokemon could have certain items equipped to them to give them a slight advantage in battle. Something most trainers may never encounter is a new addition to Generation 2 being rarer than a shiny Pokemon. That is, Pokerus. Having odds of roughly 1 in 21,845, this is one of the rarest things to encounter among wild Pokemon. In short, this infection would allow a Pokemon's hidden effort values to increase faster as they defeat Pokemon with an active infection. This essentially allows infected Pokemon to reap the benefits of effort values faster than it would have otherwise without Pokerus. If you've ever been in a very long battle in Generation 1, you may have noticed that the enemy Pokemon, both Trainer and Wild, do not run out of power points. Thankfully, this was changed in Generation 2 such that all enemy Pokemon use power points like you do in the game, meaning that when they completely run out of power points, they will resort to using Struggle. Small user interface updates can be a welcome change, one of which in Generation 2 was a visible experience bar that can be seen during battle or on a Pokemon status page. This blue bar would grow as a Pokemon gained experience until the Pokemon's level increased, in which case the bar would reset and repeat the process. Even a small change like this can make a big difference in a game like Pokemon, where level and stat increases are very satisfying, and seeing an experience bar to show progression can be very appealing. By the time of Generation 2's release of Gold and Silver, the Game Boy Color was out and allowed color variety on Game Boy games. This meant that Generation 2 would be the first time that trainers would actually get to see, in-game, a much closer representation of Pokemon to their official artwork. For example, take Butterfree. Even with the Game Boy Color in Generation 1, it appears a bluish color overall. In Generation 2, they added color palettes that gave it more detail, having more purple body with red eyes. The color palette was still limited, so the representations were not perfect. Some were even updated after Generation 2, such as Shiny Rapidash going from a purple-grayish flame color to a more completely gray flame color in Generation 3. An important feature that makes Pokemon feel much livelier, especially in 2D games, are the animations in battle. Beginning in Pokemon Crystal, trainers would now get to witness a brief Pokemon animation in battles for the first time in the main series. A new facility in Pokemon Crystal was the Battle Tower. It gave players a new way to challenge themselves by choosing a team that would be locked to a set level and face a gauntlet of consecutive trainers. While not all later generations specifically have a Battle Tower, the format of this challenge was adopted in many ways from its birth in Pokemon Crystal. It wasn't until the release of Pokemon Crystal that the main series Pokemon games allowed a player to play as a female protagonist throughout the story. This was the start of a nice change that has been built upon in later generations through more player customizations. Every Pokemon game has useful characters meant to assist you on your journey, and Generation 2 contributed to a couple of beneficiary additions, one of which is the move deleter in Blackthorn City, which now allowed players to delete HM moves from Pokemon that were previously stuck on a Pokemon once they were taught. The other addition was added in Pokemon Crystal, being the move tutor, which allowed players to give Pokemon access to a wider move pool by utilizing this NPC. Pokemon Crystal also began a trend of not only incorporating the legendaries on the cover art, but also including them in the main storyline. Suicune's presence throughout the Pokemon Crystal storyline added an element of connection with a Pokemon that was not only the face of the game, but also the title screen as well. Online connectivity in today's Pokemon games may seem like an expected feature as opposed to being a selling point. However, Generation 2 was the first time that Pokemon games took a crack at online connectivity with the mobile system's GB. By paying for this online service, players could use an adapter to connect a Pokemon Crystal game to a cell phone in order to access online features such as the latest Pokemon news and even to obtain the GS Ball for the event Celebi. They could also battle and trade with other players online using this service. Sound familiar? Online features like this for a Pokemon game seem so trivial now, but there was a time when this was revolutionary. Unfortunately, this feature was way ahead of its time, and as a result, it saw very limited success, being unreleased outside of Japan. However, its impact remains strong as ever in Pokemon games, as online features have been implemented since Generation 4, which took advantage of built-in Wi-Fi in the DS. I also wanted to point out a few changes that had an impact on the competitive scene in not just Gen 2, but later generations as well. The introduction of spikes and rapid spin ignited a playstyle to set up problems for your opponent each time they switch, as well as a solution to removing it. While much simpler in Gen 2, its playstyle can be seen in any competitive play in subsequent generations, with even more options such as Stealth Rocks and Toxic Spikes. Generation 2 also added a very important new move in Hidden Power, which essentially allowed nearly any Pokemon to have access to any move type. Even if the max power was only base 70, combining that with the same type attack bonus on a Pokemon is very useful for many Pokemon with very limited move pools. The last addition I wanted to mention was the addition of Baton Pass. This move shifted a competitive scene so that now any Pokemon using this move could pass along their stat boosts to other team members that may be unable to or struggle with raising their stats effectively. This certainly does not account for every competitive change, but these are just a few important ones that had critical impacts throughout the series. I wanted to give an honorable mention to the Pokeballs that Kurt will make for you by giving him apricorns. While some later generations contain these balls, they've never been implemented to the full Pokeball list like other Pokeballs have, being purchasable at a Pokemart. They did, however, give trainers the first taste of having to consider different factors when selecting Pokeballs to help increase their catch rate. This was certainly a change in pace from the Generation 1 contributions list, as many of the overall game mechanics had already been established prior to the start of Generation 2. However, as evident of this list, there were still plenty of changes marked by Pokemon's first major update to the main series since its initial release. We did not cover every single addition to Generation 2 that contributed to the franchise as a whole, so let us know if there are any others that you think are worth mentioning. We hope you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for the contributions of Generation 3.